Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video, I want to talk about an article called Epistemic Justice as a Virtue of Social Institutions, which was written by Elizabeth Anderson and published in 2012. So, Epistemic Justice as a Virtue of Social Institutions. The article is going to be about epistemic justice. And in particular, Anderson is going to react to Miranda Fricker's work, Epistemic Injustice, a well-known and influential book on the topic of epistemic justice. So Anderson is going to react to Fricker, and she's going to argue that Fricker puts too much emphasis on the individual aspect of epistemic justice, on the idea that in order to counteract epistemic injustice, what we need to teach individual people to be more epistemically virtuous. And against that, Anderson is going to argue that we should take the systematic, broad-scale aspect of epistemic injustice and epistemic justice more seriously, and that we should spend more time thinking about epistemic justice as something that has to happen at the social level, at the level of institutions, and therefore as something that requires virtuous social institutions. The way that Anderson sets up her article is that she begins by talking about two types of theory of distributive justice. So distributive justice is not epistemic justice. Distributive justice is about distributing limited resources. So for instance, distributing money in society. And Anderson tells us there are two types of theories about distributive justice: transactional and structural. A transactional theory of distributive justice takes as, well, the locus of justice and injustice the individual transaction. So if we're thinking about money, for instance, then a transactional theory of distributive justice would say, well, there's justice if every transaction in which people exchange money for goods or services or whatever, if each such transaction is just, right? That's where justice happens. If each transaction is just, well, then we have distributive justice. And so such a theory might, emphasize things like people doing this of their own free will, for instance, informed consent, those kinds of things. However, as Anderson points out and is well known, a system in which every transaction is sort of just in this sense might still lead to large-scale, undesirable situations which we might be tempted to think of as unjust. So, for instance, Anderson's own example is the stock market, right? A lot of people could make free decisions on the stock market, nothing unjust happening there, leading to big economic crashes and other problems that make sure a lot of people lose their jobs, fall into poverty, and so on and so forth. And we might want to say that even though, everyone on the stock market was they were not individually behaving unjustly. Every transaction they made with other stockbrokers was sort of okay. Nevertheless, there's something in the system here, right? The system where stockbrokers can crash the economy and make other people lose their jobs. There's something unjust in the system here, right? And if you think that there's something unjust in the system here, then you will be tempted to come up with a structural theory of distributive justice. A theory which says, no, we can't just look at the individual transaction. We have to look at the way that society is structured as a whole, and we have to make sure that the institutions are just. The institutions by which we distribute scarce resources like money. Okay, so the reason that Anderson starts by talking about distributive justice is that she thinks that this distinction between the transactional and the structural is also important when we talk about epistemic justice and epistemic injustice. And so when she talks about Miranda Fricker's theory of epistemic injustice, she says, well, look, Fricker acknowledges and sees that there can be injustice both at a transactional level and at a structural level. But all her remedies are at the individual level, right? What she calls for is more individual virtue in our epistemic transactions. And that's not going to do the job. right? We need more, we need something else. We need justice at the level of institutions. Okay, so Fricker talks about two types of epistemic injustice. One is testimonial, and the other is hermeneutical. Testimonial epistemic injustice are situations where I, or somebody else, like some person, is not believed, their testimony is not believed, because of certain prejudices, right? And so, for instance, one example of testimonial injustice would be if somebody, let's say, if a woman is in a court of law and the jury decides, well, maybe not decides, but the jury ends up not believing her because she is a woman and supposed to be maybe too emotional and not sort of in rational control of the evidence, and so on and so forth, right? That would be an testimonial injustice because somebody is not believed based on factors that really don't have anything to do with how good her testimony is, but based on prejudice. In this case, a prejudice against women. The other type of injustice that Fricker talks about is hermeneutical injustice. And hermeneutical injustice is what happens when a society lacks the cognitive resources that allow us, or that would allow everyone really, to make sense of the experiences of a certain subgroup in society. So let me say that again. Hermeneutical injustice is what happens when the experiences of certain subgroups of society can't be understood because there are not the right concepts, not the right ways of thinking, and so on to make sense of that. Fricker's own main example here is the example of sexual harassment. So especially sexual harassment of women by men. And she points out, she tells the story really, of how this idea, this notion of sexual harassment sort of came up only in the middle of the 20th century and was very slowly taken up. And before it was taken up, right, I mean, these experiences of harassment were seen by in a sense, almost everyone as, just jokes or just the way things worked, or, something you needed to live with because that's just the difference between men and women or something like that. And of course, there are people who still think that way. But the idea is that there was in society, like, the ways of thinking that allowed us to understand certain experiences as the experience of being harassed just wasn't there. And that this was an injustice to the people who had those experiences, right? I mean, their experiences weren't, they couldn't be sort of taken at face value, they couldn't be understood, maybe not even by themselves, that's what Fricker says, but certainly not by society as a whole. Okay. Now, Anderson points out that while testimonial injustice can be either at the individual level or structural, right? If I don't believe women, it's individual. If society as a whole tends not to believe women, then it's structural. Whereas hermeneutical injustice is always structural, right? So clearly there are structural forms of epistemic injustice, and also clearly Fricker sees this. Now, when Fricker talks about what makes epistemic injustice unjust, right? When is there injustice? When is there moral culpability going on, right? If I don't believe someone for some bizarre reason, like maybe somebody knows a lot about a topic, but I still don't believe them, I'm kind of just harming myself, right? It's stupid maybe, it's ill-advised, but it's not unjust. So in what cases is there injustice? Well, Fricker says there's injustice if we can trace back the lack of belief, for instance, in testimonial injustice, if we can trace it back to bias, right? To biases that are there in society. So if people don't believe women in court, well, that would be unjust because there's a bias against women sort of playing a role here. So prejudice is wrongful, right? Having these prejudicial biases is wrongful, and that wrong is sort of transmitted from the premise to the epistemic errors that it causes. Now, Anderson says the fact that Fricker stresses this sort of identity-based bias source of epistemic injustice has two consequences. And here's what she says. This is page 167. She says, first, it appears that identity-based epistemic injustice even when structural, must ultimately trace its origins to one or more transactional injustices grounded in identity prejudice. Second, if prejudice is the cause of testimonial injustice, then it would seem that the remedy would require taking steps to check prejudice. So what it does, right, this story about where the injustice comes from, according to Anderson, is it makes sure that we stress the individual transactional nature of the injustices, right? Because it's the individual transactional situations where I am biased against you. I mean, that's where the harm starts. That's where the injustice starts. And so that's what we have to remedy, right? We have to train me to be less biased, right? That's the way to sort of counter that. Okay. Now, Anderson is going to make two kinds of criticism of that. The first is, she says, more friendly, more an amendment to Fricker's theory, and the other is more, well, I guess more hostile. She doesn't use the word, but it's more of a criticism. So the first, more friendly one is that even to counter transactional injustices, we might need structural remedies, because it's really hard for people to be aware of their biases and counteract them, right? If I live in a society that is generally biased against women, then even if I am very much like consciously planning to not be biased against women, it can be really hard to detect when that kind of bias creeps into my judgment and my decision making. And if it's very hard to detect that, it's also very hard for me to counteract it. And so we might need, we might need structural remedies, right, at the level of society and social institutions in order to get rid of the epistemic injustice. So structural remedies need to be stressed even when the injustices at issue are transactional, is what Anderson wants to say. The second challenge is more of a criticism of Fricker, and it's the idea that structural forms of even testimonial injustice are more pervasive than Fricker acknowledges, and that such structural injustices require structural remedies. And Anderson starts talking about this on page 169. So what Anderson then does is she describes three ways in which we can have systematic testimonial injustice, even though there is no real transactional testimonial injustice, right? Nobody is really at fault at any point. There's no individual who does anything that's morally culpable, and still we end up in a structurally unjust situation. Just as in the example of the stockbrokers, right, when we are talking about distributive justice, where the stockbrokers, I mean, none of them maybe did anything that was morally wrong, and yet the end result was an unjust situation in society. Okay, I'm not going to go through all three mechanisms that Anderson talks about. I'm just going to mention one, which is differential access to the markers of credibility. So what does that mean? Well, suppose you meet someone who wants to, tell you their opinion about something. How do you decide whether to believe them? Well, you've got, maybe certain biases that are wrong, but you've probably also, and you ought to have certain other ways of determining whether somebody is believable or not. So, for instance, if somebody wants to tell you their analysis of society, well, one thing that you're probably going to want to find out is, what kind of education does this person have? I mean, what did they study? Do they know anything about what they're talking about? Do they have the right background to sort of make these statements about society as a whole? Did they study sociology and politics and whatnot? So education is a very obvious differential marker of credibility, right? Of course, it depends on the kind of topic, but there definitely are topics where having a good education of the right kind makes you more believable, right? And ought to make you more believable. Okay, so if you want to know what people's... So here's an example. Suppose you're interested in getting medical knowledge, right? Who should you believe? Well, you should believe trained doctors more than people who have not been trained as doctors. Okay, that seems sort of obvious. There's nothing wrong with believing trained doctors more than believing people who are not trained doctors. There's nothing wrong with that. But now it could be the case that there's differential access to that kind of education, right? So maybe we're living in a society where only men can train to be doctors, right? And so it would be completely correct for me to never give full credibility to a woman who is talking about medical matters because no women have been trained as doctors, right? That could be completely right in a sense. And yet it could at the same time lead to a kind of structural injustice where women's insight into their own bodies, right, and the way that the bodies of women differ maybe from the bodies of men, and the way that maybe medical treatment of women should be different from the medical treatment of men, and so on and so forth, that kind of perspective never really gets heard, right? Because there's a structural problem here. And the structural problem is that women don't get the same kind of access to like medical training that men do. And even though every individual person is completely right to believe doctors more than non-doctors, nevertheless, we have a situation of systematic injustice where women's voices about health are heard less than men's voices about health. Okay, so that would be an example where there is a structural form of epistemic injustice, testimonial epistemic injustice going on, which obviously requires a systematic solution, right? I can try to be as virtuous and non-biased as possible, but that's not really going to help in this case, because it's right for me to believe doctors more than non-doctors, right? So what we should do is change society, right? And so, well, Anderson is really sort of setting up for epistemic injustice the equivalent of a systematic theory of distributive justice, right? And the idea is that we need to tackle this kind of issue not only at the level of individuals and their biases, but also and maybe especially at the level of social institutions as a whole. Thank you.